Britain was bleeding, not from bullets or bombs, but from miles. The war had stretched the sky itself into an enemy. Pilots could see the heart of the Reich, the factories, the airfields, the steel veins that fed Hitler's empire, but they couldn't reach them. Every mission that crossed the invisible fuel line was a gamble with death. The ocean of air between England and Germany had become a graveyard of brave men. Engines roared across the British countryside like caged thunder. Squadrons lined up in the fog, their wings heavy with bombs, their tanks filled to the brim. But everyone on those airfields knew the truth. The aircraft were powerful, but short-breathed. The farther they flew, the faster death closed in. Crews joked darkly about their fuel gauges, but no one laughed for long. Every returning flight brought fewer planes. Every mission beyond range ended the same way: a flare in the dark, a silent crash into the sea. The Royal Air Force was desperate. They had machines that could crush a city, but only if they could reach it. Berlin might as well have been on another planet. High Command ordered engineers to find solutions. They added extra tanks, lightened the payloads, even experimented with dangerous fuel mixtures. But nature had no mercy. The engines overheated, the flow faltered, the planes burned. The men called it the range curse. Engineers called it physics. And every night, when pilots didn't return, the mechanics stood by the runway staring into the darkness, wondering how much longer they could keep fighting a war their machines weren't built to win. Somewhere in that hopeless routine, a whisper began to spread through the workshops, a rumor about a strange design. Not a new engine. Not a bigger tank. Something smaller. Stranger. A fuel pump. The idea sounded ridiculous. A pump couldn't win a war. But those who understood engines knew better. Fuel was the bloodstream of flight. The way it was pushed, mixed, and burned could mean the difference between a machine that died in the sky and one that could cross a continent. According to the whispers, one man, an engineer whose name no one said aloud, had been working on a pump that could keep pressure steady even when tanks were nearly empty. It would let bombers squeeze every drop of power out of their fuel without melting their engines. The design had been shown once before to the Air Ministry. It had been rejected instantly. Too unstable, they said. Too dangerous. The project was buried. The engineer had been warned to drop it. But the rumor refused to die. In hangars dimly lit by single bulbs, men spoke of a forbidden pump that might save them all, if it didn't blow them up first. The Air Ministry was terrified of innovation that couldn't be controlled. Wartime command thrived on order, not experiments. They wanted predictable, repeatable, safe machines. But war was no longer predictable. Every day, Germany built faster fighters and longer-range bombers. The Allies were falling behind. At a small research base in the English Midlands, one group of mechanics worked through the night, stripping old engines, recalculating pressure lines, arguing in whispers. The air outside was thick with the sound of distant artillery, the war always there, even in the dark. Among them was a quiet, unremarkable man who never left the workshop. He kept his name off the reports. He didn't care about credit or promotion. He only cared about one problem: how to make fuel last longer than fear. For months, no one had spoken his name in the open. Some said he'd been banned from official projects. Others said he'd been transferred to a parts depot as punishment. But every few weeks, a mechanic would find notes tucked under toolboxes, rough sketches of fuel lines, handwritten equations, designs with strange annotations, steady flow under negative pressure, minimize cavitation, pressure equalization beyond tolerance. It was engineering poetry. And it was dangerous. The RAF didn't want mavericks. They wanted rules. But the sky didn't care about rules, only results. And the results were getting worse. By late 1941, bomber losses had reached unbearable numbers. Every mission briefing began with the same warning: fuel capacity insufficient for return route. Pilots went anyway. They were tired of watching Europe burn, while Britain could only circle the edges. Each time they launched, they were gambling against distance itself. Engineers began breaking rank. They tried unapproved modifications, adjusted carburetors, rewired valves. Some got caught and were reassigned. Others vanished quietly. But the problem remained. The war was being strangled not by the enemy's strength, but by its own reach. One night, as a storm rolled over the airfield, a senior mechanic named Latham stood outside the hangar, watching a test plane roar down the runway and lift into the black sky. It was supposed to be a simple endurance test, nothing risky. But minutes later, fire lit up the horizon. The plane had gone down. Another engine failure. Another crew lost to fuel starvation. Latham slammed his fist against the metal door. "This can't go on," he muttered. "We're fighting a war with machines that can't survive it." Inside, a younger mechanic looked up from his workbench. "There's a man," he said quietly, "who thinks he can fix it." Latham frowned. "Who?" The boy hesitated. "They say he built a pump. Not approved. Not safe. But it works." Latham laughed bitterly. "If it worked, we'd be using it." The boy shrugged. Maybe he never stopped building it. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the roof. Latham stared at the engines lined up in silence, machines ready to kill, or die, or both. He didn't believe in miracles. But the war had turned disbelief into a luxury no one could afford. Across Britain, other engineers were asking the same questions. Somewhere, deep inside Rolls-Royce's testing division, a handful of technicians were quietly working past curfew, ignoring orders. They had seen the notes. They knew the risks. But they also knew that if they didn't try, there might not be a Britain left to fight for. No one would admit it, but desperation had become permission. By the end of the year, the war's front lines had changed. Not on land, not at sea, but in the quiet corners of hangars and laboratories. Somewhere in that maze of fear and secrecy, a man was preparing to challenge the laws of combustion themselves. His design had been banned. His name erased from official records. But his idea, his forbidden pump, was alive. And soon, it would do what every pilot had dreamed of since the war began: break the range of death and turn the sky from prison to weapon. The war was tightening its grip, and Britain's factories pulsed with the rhythm of desperation. Night and day, the roar of engines filled the air, machines born from fear, forged for survival. But behind one locked door, far from official oversight, a single man was building something the ministry had already buried. His name was Harold Bolton, and he was about to commit the most dangerous act of defiance an engineer could make in wartime Britain: to think for himself. Bolton was not a soldier. He didn't carry a rifle or wear medals. His battlefield was a workbench, covered in copper tubing, blueprints, and half-burnt coffee cups. Where others saw steel and fuel, he saw rhythm, the breathing of engines, the heartbeat of flight. For months, he'd watched pilots die because their machines couldn't fly far enough. To him, every wrecked bomber was not a tragedy, but a flaw in the equation. And flaws, he believed, could be fixed. He had once presented his high-pressure fuel pump, designed to the Air Ministry, confident it could extend range without overloading engines. But they'd called it unstable and impractical. The reports said his device risked catastrophic detonation under variable altitude. In short, they told him to forget it. Bolton didn't. He knew the risk. The pump operated at pressures that frightened even veteran mechanics. If it failed, it wouldn't just stop the engine, it would ignite the entire aircraft midair. But Bolton saw beyond the danger. He saw a pattern. The way fuel lost pressure at high altitude wasn't random, it was predictable. Controllable. He just needed the right balance between flow and pressure, the right harmony between power and restraint. Officially, the project was over. Unofficially, he was only getting started. He began working nights, using leftover parts from scrapped aircraft. A few junior engineers noticed the lights in his hangar long after everyone else had gone home. Some mocked him. Others were drawn to the madness. They started helping, quietly, secretly, one by one. Together, they formed a team without papers, without pay, without permission. Every night was a battle between invention and exhaustion. They built prototypes from spare aluminum, scavenged valves from wrecked Merlins, even hand-machined parts by candlelight when power shortages hit. The first test failed instantly. The pump shattered, spraying fuel like a geyser. Bolton wiped the soot off his face and muttered, "We're learning." The second test lasted 3 minutes before the engine exploded. The third burned through the tubing. By the 7th attempt, the hangar reeked of oil and failure. But Bolton refused to stop. His hands shook from fatigue, his eyes bloodshot, but every failure brought him closer to the truth. He started sleeping beside the engines, scrawling equations on the concrete floor with chalk. "Pressure is life," he whispered once, when a colleague asked why he didn't just give up. "If we can control pressure, we can control distance." Then, one cold morning, after weeks of endless failure, it happened. The test engine roared to life, smooth and steady. The pump hummed, no sputter, no smoke, no flame. For the first time, the pressure held. 5 minutes. Then 10. The engine purred like it was alive. The men stared in disbelief, too afraid to cheer in case it failed. Bolton shut the throttle, took a deep breath, and smiled for the first time in months. "Now," he said softly, "we find out if it flies." But success was only half the battle. The Air Ministry had already banned his design. No aircraft could be fitted with unapproved systems, not even for testing. If discovered, he'd be finished, stripped of clearance, possibly arrested. Yet Bolton knew data meant nothing without proof in the air. So he made a decision that would change everything. He smuggled the pump into a bomber maintenance program at RAF Scampton. He filed it under an ordinary parts replacement form, Type 47B Auxiliary Regulator. No one looked twice. He approached a young pilot named Lieutenant Harris, known for his reckless confidence. "I've made some adjustments to your fuel system," Bolton told him carefully. "If you notice any changes in range or flow, log them." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Am I flying with your secret contraption, Harold?" Bolton hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Let's just say, you might go farther than usual." The next morning, under a grey dawn, the modified bomber lifted off. The crew didn't know they were carrying a banned experiment in their belly. As they climbed, Bolton stood at the edge of the runway, his heart hammering like the pistons inside the aircraft. The plane vanished into the clouds. Hours passed. No radio. No word. Every second stretched like an hour. Then, against all odds, the bomber returned. It touched down smoother than ever. Harris climbed out, his flight jacket streaked with frost, a grin on his face. "You won't believe this," he shouted. "We still had fuel left. A lot of it." Bolton said nothing. He just nodded, staring at the engine, listening to the steady cooling ticks of metal. It had worked. That night, word spread quietly among the engineering crews. They called it the Ghost Pump. A system that could make a bomber fly farther than any official design. Some laughed it off as rumor. Others asked questions. A few brave mechanics began secretly installing Bolton's pump on other aircraft. Within weeks, a handful of modified bombers were flying deeper into enemy territory and coming back. Reports reached headquarters. Unexplained range increase observed. Possible fuel efficiency anomaly. The ministry dismissed it as pilot error or lucky wind. But the pattern kept repeating. Bolton's little rebellion was spreading, unseen, unstoppable. He started receiving anonymous notes from other engineers. "We tested your design. It works. Your ratios hold even under climb. Keep quiet. They are watching." And they were. By the summer of 1942, the Air Ministry's Technical Division began investigating unauthorized modifications. They traced them back to a cluster of maintenance hangars, and then to Bolton. He was summoned for questioning. The tone was cold, bureaucratic. "You've been warned before about unsanctioned designs," an officer said. "Do you understand the risk of what you've done?" Bolton didn't flinch. "I understand the risk of doing nothing," he replied. "Every day, men die because their range ends before their courage does." The officer stared at him, silent. There was no reply that could stop what had already begun. They threatened to shut his program, but by then, it was too late. The forbidden pump was already in the field. Weeks later, Allied bombers returned from missions once thought impossible, hitting targets deep in occupied Europe and returning alive. No one could explain it publicly, but every engineer who knew the truth whispered the same thing. The pump had changed the war. Harold Bolton had done what the ministry forbade. He had extended the reach of Britain's air power with nothing more than stubbornness and genius. But in a world ruled by secrecy, brilliance was a dangerous thing. The rain had been falling since dawn, soaking the grey stone buildings of the War Ministry, like the sky itself disapproved of what was happening inside. In a high-ceilinged conference room, under flickering lamps and clouds of cigarette smoke, a group of men in uniforms and suits gathered around a polished table. On it lay a single report stamped in red. Unauthorized fuel system deployment, classified. The man at the head of the table, Air Marshal Sir Geoffrey Wallace, tapped the paper with his pipe. "This ghost pump," he said slowly, "is now present in at least 27 aircraft. None of them approved. All reporting range increases of 20% or more." He looked up sharply. "Who is behind this?" The answer came from a technical officer, voice cautious, almost apologetic. "Harold Bolton, sir. Rolls-Royce engineer. Independent modifications to the Merlin's fuel systems. We've issued 3 warnings." Wallace leaned back, exhaling smoke. "And yet, his engines outperform ours." That was the problem. Bolton's forbidden design, the high-pressure fuel pump, was working. Too well. Missions once thought impossible were succeeding. Bombers were reaching targets deep in Germany, then returning with fuel to spare. What had begun as a secret rebellion by one man was now altering the shape of the air war itself. But in the ministry, success without permission was still treason. Bolton was brought to London under official summons. When he arrived, soaked and unshaven, he looked less like a hero and more like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The guards led him through endless corridors until he stood before the panel. Air Marshal Wallace didn't waste time. "Mr. Bolton, you are accused of willfully disobeying direct orders, tampering with military equipment, and distributing untested machinery into combat aircraft. Do you deny this?" Bolton met his gaze. "No, sir." "Then why do it?" Wallace demanded. "You could have killed pilots, destroyed aircraft, compromised missions." "I could have," Bolton interrupted, his voice calm. "But I didn't. The pump works. It's saving lives. You have the reports." Wallace slammed his hand on the table. "That's not the point," he barked. "You don't decide what's safe. You don't decide what gets built. The chain of command exists for a reason." Bolton's eyes hardened. "And while you were waiting for permission, men were dying for lack of fuel." The room went silent. For a long moment, only the rain could be heard against the windows. Then Wallace spoke, quieter this time. "You think you've done something noble, Mr. Bolton. But war isn't a place for rebels. It's a place for discipline." Bolton said nothing. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was predictable: suspension, loss of clearance, and an order to cease all experimental work. His designs were confiscated. His workshop was sealed. Officially, Harold Bolton's name was erased from every technical record. Unofficially, something else was happening. Within days, senior engineers across multiple RAF bases began receiving quiet orders: maintain current fuel systems as per field-modified configuration. No one mentioned Bolton, but everyone knew. His pump had become too effective to discard. The Air Ministry couldn't publicly endorse it, but they couldn't afford to remove it either. Bolton returned to Derby under supervision, banned from all research. He was assigned to paperwork, fuel consumption logs, maintenance schedules, the bureaucratic graveyard for disgraced engineers. But even there, he noticed something extraordinary. Every new set of mission reports told the same story: longer flights, fewer losses, higher success rates. His design was still out there, flying, working, winning. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at his desk with no return address. Inside was a single line, handwritten. "They can't stop it. The pump is standard now. You changed everything." Bolton smiled faintly. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel pride. But the war had a way of punishing heroes who didn't follow orders. By early 1943, rumors spread that the Luftwaffe had learned about Britain's range advantage. Intelligence suggested they were developing intercept tactics for bombers flying deeper into their territory. The ministry feared a leak. Their immediate suspicion? Bolton. He was interrogated again, this time not in London, but in a dimly lit room by intelligence officers. "Who did you share your designs with?" they demanded. "How did the Germans learn of your system?" Bolton was stunned. "I shared nothing," he protested. "I built it to keep our boys alive, not to arm the enemy." The interrogator leaned in. "Then how did they know?" Bolton couldn't answer. But history would later reveal what he couldn't. Spies within the ministry had been selling technical blueprints to Berlin. Bolton's name had been used as a scapegoat, a convenient cover for the real betrayal. Weeks later, he was quietly dismissed from service for security concerns. No trial, no appeal. The man who had extended Britain's air reach was now officially a liability. He returned home to a small cottage on the outskirts of Derby. The war raged on, but his world had gone silent. His workbench stood empty. The hum of the engines he once loved was now only a memory. Then, one night in 1944, long after he'd given up expecting redemption, a car arrived at his door. Two men stepped out, one in uniform, one in a dark civilian coat. "Mr. Bolton," the officer said, "the ministry requests your assistance." Bolton hesitated. "I thought I was finished." The man in the coat smiled faintly. "We all are, until the next crisis." He was taken to a hangar outside Cambridge. Inside stood a massive bomber unlike any he'd seen before, the prototype for a new long-range aircraft meant to carry heavier loads farther than ever. But its engineers were struggling with one problem: fuel stability at high altitude. Bolton walked slowly around the machine, tracing its lines with his hand. "Your fuel system," he murmured, "it can't handle pressure drop beyond 20,000 feet. It'll choke." The head engineer nodded miserably. "We know. No one can make it stable." Bolton looked at him, and then, without a word, took out a small notebook from his coat pocket. On the cover were faded numbers, smudged from oil. His old formulae. His forbidden ratios. "I can," he said simply. Bolton didn't smile. "No," he said softly. "The men flying it will." The forbidden pump that once risked his career had carried Britain's bombers across the skies. Farther, faster, safer. It became the invisible heart of victory. And though history forgot his name, every time an engine roared to life in the decades that followed, a small part of Harold Bolton's defiance lived on. The proof that sometimes, the difference between obedience and genius is just the courage to disobey.